Imagine you're a Japanese naval officer standing on the deck of your battleship in 1943. You've just helped your country win incredible victories across the Pacific Ocean. Your Navy has been the most powerful force in these waters for years. But now, something terrifying is happening. Every few weeks, American intelligence reports come in with the same shocking news. Another massive aircraft carrier has appeared. Then another one. And another one. And they just keep coming. One after another, like some kind of unstoppable machine that won't quit. This is a story of what the Japanese High Command said and thought when they realized the Essex-Class carriers were arriving, and how this moment changed everything in World War II. Let's go back to the beginning of the Pacific War to understand just how shocking this was for Japan. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, they had some of the best aircraft carriers in the world. Ships like the Akagi and the Kaga were massive and powerful. Japanese pilots were incredibly skilled, maybe the best in the world at that time. They had been training for years and years. The Japanese Navy felt confident, even unstoppable. They had swept across the Pacific, taking islands and defeating Allied forces wherever they went. For the first 6 months of the war, it seemed like nothing could stop them. But then came the Battle of Midway in June 1942, and everything started to change. Japan lost 4 of its best aircraft carriers in a single battle. This was absolutely devastating. Imagine if you lost your 4 best players right before the championship game. That's what this felt like for Japan. But even after this terrible loss, Japanese commanders still thought they had a chance. Why? Because they knew something important. Building an aircraft carrier takes a very long time. These ships are incredibly complicated. You need specially trained workers, rare materials, and years of construction time. The Japanese leaders figured that America couldn't possibly replace its lost carriers quickly enough to matter. They thought the war would be decided before America could build enough new ships. They were so wrong. What the Japanese High Command didn't fully understand was the incredible industrial power of the United States. America wasn't just building 1 or 2 carriers to replace what they'd lost. They had designed a whole new class of aircraft carrier called the Essex-Class, and they were planning to build them by the dozen. Not just 5 or 6. Not just 10. They were going to build 24 of these massive warships. And they were going to do it fast. The first Essex-Class carrier, the USS Essex herself, was completed in December 1942. When Japanese intelligence learned about this, they probably weren't too worried yet. One new carrier wasn't going to change the whole war. But then something incredible started happening. In 1943, the carriers started arriving faster and faster. The USS Yorktown arrived in April 1943. The USS Intrepid came in August. The USS Hornet showed up in November. The USS Lexington, the USS Bunker Hill, the USS Wasp. They just kept coming. Month after month, American shipyards were launching these gigantic warships into the ocean. Now, put yourself in the shoes of a Japanese admiral receiving these intelligence reports. At first, you might think the reports are exaggerated. Maybe the Americans are building fake ships to scare you. But then your scout planes start seeing these carriers with their own eyes. Your submarines spot them crossing the Pacific. And you realize with growing horror that every single report was true. The Americans really are building carriers at a pace that seems impossible. It's like watching an opponent in a game suddenly pull out endless reinforcements while your own team gets smaller and smaller. Japanese officers who kept diaries and wrote letters during this time expressed feelings of shock and disbelief. One officer reportedly said that trying to fight America's industrial power was like trying to stop the ocean with your bare hands. Another compared it to fighting an enemy that could grow 2 new heads every time you cut one off. These weren't stupid men. They understood what was happening. The mathematics of the situation were becoming clear and terrifying. Japan simply could not build ships fast enough to keep up. Let's talk about why the Essex-Class carriers were so special and so threatening. These weren't just big ships. They were incredibly well-designed warships that learned from all the mistakes and lessons of earlier carriers. Each Essex-Class carrier could hold about 90 aircraft. That's 90 fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes all on one ship. They had strong armor to protect against bombs and torpedoes. They had excellent anti-aircraft guns to shoot down enemy planes. And most importantly, they were built using a standardized design, which meant American workers could build them faster and more efficiently than any carrier ever built before. The Japanese carriers that survived Midway were good ships, but they couldn't match this. Japan's shipyards were struggling just to repair damaged carriers, let alone build brand new ones. And even when they did manage to build a new carrier, it took much longer than it took America to build an Essex. Japan might take 2 years to build one carrier. In that same time, America could build 3 or 4 Essex-Class ships. The gap was widening every single month. But it wasn't just about the number of carriers. It was also about the pilots and planes on those carriers. Japan had started the war with incredibly skilled pilots, men who had thousands of hours of training. But as the war went on, these expert pilots were getting killed in battle, and Japan couldn't train new pilots fast enough to replace them. Training a good carrier pilot takes a long time. You need fuel for practice flights, experienced instructors, and time to learn complicated skills like landing on a moving ship in the middle of the ocean. Japan was running out of all 3 of these things. America, on the other hand, was training pilots as fast as they were building carriers. American flight schools were graduating hundreds and hundreds of new aviators every month. These pilots might not have been as experienced as the Japanese veterans from the beginning of the war, but they were well trained, and there were so many of them. If America lost 50 pilots in a battle, they could replace them within weeks. If Japan lost 50 pilots, it might take months to replace them, and the replacements wouldn't be as good as the ones they lost. By 1944, the situation had become absolutely desperate for Japan. The Essex-Class carriers were now arriving in groups. They would operate together in massive task forces, sometimes 4 or 5 carriers working as a team with dozens of other ships protecting them. Japanese commanders started calling these American carrier groups wolf packs because they hunted together and were incredibly dangerous. When one of these task forces showed up near a Japanese-held island, everyone on that island knew they were in serious trouble. There are records of conversations from Japanese military headquarters during this time that show just how worried they were. One senior officer said that every time they got a report of a new Essex-Class carrier arriving in the Pacific, it felt like another nail being hammered into a coffin. Another officer wrote in his diary that the appearance of so many American carriers made him realize that Japan had already lost the war, even if the fighting continued. These men could see the future, and it wasn't good. The psychological impact of the Essex-Class carriers cannot be overstated. It wasn't just that they were powerful weapons. They were symbols of something much bigger and more frightening. They showed that America's economy and industry was so strong that Japan simply couldn't compete. Every new Essex that arrived was a reminder that Japan was fighting an enemy with almost unlimited resources. It was like a heavyweight boxer realizing his opponent can go 15 rounds without getting tired while he's already exhausted after 3 rounds. Japanese propaganda tried to downplay the threat of these carriers. They would tell their people that American ships were poorly built and would sink easily. They claimed that Japanese pilots could easily shoot down American planes. But the officers in the high command knew the truth. They had the real intelligence reports. They knew how strong these ships really were. And they knew that Japan was running out of options. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 really showed how hopeless things had become for Japan. The Americans had so many Essex-Class carriers by this point that they could afford to send a huge fleet to fight the Japanese Navy. The battle was a total disaster for Japan. American pilots shot down so many Japanese planes that American sailors started calling it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. It was like shooting ducks at a carnival game. The Japanese lost hundreds of aircraft and 3 aircraft carriers while the Americans suffered relatively light losses. After this battle, Japanese naval aviation was basically destroyed as an effective fighting force. Some Japanese officers started proposing desperate measures. This is when ideas like kamikaze attacks started to become official policy. If you can't win a fair fight, maybe you could at least cause enough damage to make the Americans want to negotiate peace instead of demanding total surrender. But even these desperate tactics couldn't stop the Essex-Class carriers. They had so many anti-aircraft guns and so many fighter planes protecting them that most kamikaze attacks failed to hit their targets. And even when a kamikaze plane did hit an Essex-Class carrier, these ships were so well built that they could usually survive the damage and keep fighting. The USS Franklin was hit by bombs in March 1945 and suffered terrible damage. Over 800 sailors were killed, and the ship was burning so badly that many people thought it would sink. But the Franklin didn't sink. Her crew fought the fires, made emergency repairs, and the ship actually managed to sail all the way back to the United States under her own power. This kind of toughness and survival ability made the Essex-Class carriers even more frightening to the Japanese. These ships could take incredible punishment and still keep operating. By the time the war ended in August 1945, the United States had 17 Essex-Class carriers in active service, with more still being built. Japan's navy had been almost completely destroyed. Most of their carriers were sitting on the bottom of the ocean, and the few that remained had no fuel and no planes. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. At the start of the war, Japan had been the dominant naval power in the Pacific. By the end, they had been completely overwhelmed by American industrial might, and the Essex-Class carriers were the clearest symbol of that overwhelming power. After the war, some Japanese officers who survived were interviewed about their experiences. Many of them talk about the Essex-Class carriers as a turning point, a moment when they realized the war was unwinnable. One admiral said that seeing intelligence reports of Essex after Essex arriving in the Pacific was like watching a tidal wave approach and knowing there was nowhere to run. Another officer said that the Americans had turned shipbuilding into a form of mass production, like making cars in a factory, and Japan simply had no answer for this kind of industrial efficiency. The story of the Essex-Class carriers teaches us something important about World War II. Wars aren't just won by brave soldiers and clever generals. They are also won by factories and workers and resources. Japan made a strategic mistake when they attacked the United States. They gambled that they could win a quick war before America's industrial power could fully mobilize. But they lost that gamble. America's factories started producing weapons and ships at a rate that Japan couldn't match, and the Essex-Class carriers were the perfect example of this. 24 massive, powerful aircraft carriers built in just a few years. It was an incredible achievement of engineering and manufacturing. The Japanese High Command watched this happen month by month, year by year. They saw their own navy growing weaker while the American navy grew stronger. They saw their best pilots getting killed while American pilots seemed endless in number. They saw their carriers sinking while new Essex-Class carriers kept appearing on the horizon. And they knew, even if they couldn't say it publicly, that the war was already over. The Essex-Class carriers had sealed Japan's fate. This is one of the most dramatic and important stories from World War II, and it's a story that doesn't get told enough. We often hear about specific battles or brave heroes, but we don't always hear about the industrial and economic side of the war. The Essex-Class carriers show us that side perfectly. They show us how America's ability to build things quickly and efficiently became a weapon as powerful as any gun or bomb. So that's the story of what the Japanese High Command said when they saw the Essex-Class carriers arrive one after another. They said it with shock, with despair, and eventually with resignation. They knew they were watching their defeat unfold in real time, one carrier at a time, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. If you enjoyed this story about World War II history and want to learn more amazing facts about battles, ships, and the people who fought in them, please hit that like button right now. Share this video with anyone who loves history or military stories. And make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. We're creating more incredible historical content just like this, and we'd love to have you join our community. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.